A good strategy is a process, dynamic and emergent. A bad strategy is a static plan, little more than a thoughtless checklist. Throughout history, we see average thinkers enter the world of strategy making with a flawed preconception of what constitutes great strategy. They sometimes search for a secret strategy when the real secret is thinking strategically. They search for a secret external to them when the secret is within them, perhaps. Strategy is no simple schedule. It's no formula in a manual. This perspective on strategy has informed the best military commanders of history, and it continues to inform the best leaders of today, wherever they compete. So in this lecture, we'll learn strategic lessons from 5 of the best military commanders and thinkers in history. As we do, try to come up with ways that these lessons can be relevant in your own life and work. These lessons must be adapted to your own situation. Remember, the person who merely follows a checklist will always lose to the rival who knows when to abandon the checklist. The ancient world learned this lesson painfully, again and again, only with the spilling of much blood. But the meaning and importance of strategy eventually became crystal clear, at least to a few, and it's the hard-won clarity of the ancients that we should strive to acquire as thoroughly as possible. The first steps towards strategic thinking are the most precarious, so you may want to pause the lectures in this course several times to think hard about your own professional or personal challenges. For this lecture in particular, learn from the challenges these thinkers met. Then, try to apply the principles you learn in this lecture to improve your own strategic thinking. So let's examine the origins of strategy in the ancient world with a focus on a handful of the most influential thinkers and practitioners. Well, they aren't the only great strategic figures of ancient times, of course, but each of the figures we consider represents a fundamental turning point in the development of strategic thinking. Just as important, although military affairs were the crucible for their insights, what they have to offer can inform our own efforts at strategic thinking in many areas of life, whether in business, as parents, or in the community. Let's begin in ancient Greece in 5th century BC. An aristocrat by the name of Thucydides fought in a great war between the Greek city-states of Athens and Sparta, which lasted 27 years, from 431 to 404 BC. Thucydides carried the rank of strategos, or general, and he penned a history of the war until the year 411. His masterful history of the Peloponnesian War offers insights about causes and effects. It focuses on the behavior and motivations of the two sides, and it excludes references to the acts of gods and goddesses. It is what might be called scientific history, and it carries much of the character of a modern historical account. Nearly 2,500 years later, this ancient treatise serves as the starting point for the field of international relations, the foundation for a school of thought called political realism, and our earliest account of strategic thinking in action. Thucydides wrote clearly, concisely. In fact, his work exhibits a coolness and detachment, and it conveys skepticism about concepts such as justice, especially in this short and famous passage from a dialogue between the Athenian military and inhabitants on the Aegean island of Melos in this so-called Melian dialogue. The Athenians forthrightly asserted their superior armed might as the only arbiter required to exact Melian cooperation. Quote, "You know as well as we do that right, as the world goes, is only in question between equals in power, while the strong do what they can and the weak suffer what they must." In this one key passage, notions of fairness, of justice, of reason, even of intervention by the gods were swept away. Ancient Greece in the time of Thucydides was a squabbling group of city-states that constantly aligned and realigned themselves into different coalitions when they weren't uniting to battle with enemies external to Greece. Now, in modern terms, these cities sought a balance of power so that no city-state could grow strong enough to dominate its neighbors. So here is our first lesson. Thucydides wrote about power, and the Melian dialogue presents us today with an archetype for power politics or realpolitik. In your own professional life, what's a situation where power remains paramount? Is there a market or competitive field where overwhelming force or vicious competition is not only the most effective strategy, but the only logical one? How can you leverage your organization's advantages to score an overwhelming victory? But here's something surprising. Despite the fact that the generals of Athens were called strategos, there wasn't a lot of actual strategy in use. In fact, you might take it as a rule of thumb that the longer a conflict drags on, as the Peloponnesian War actually did, the more likely it is that one or both sides lack an effective strategy. So when we want to see strategy at work within the Peloponnesian War, we find ourselves looking at an apparently insignificant battle that featured none of the leading generals from either side. This was the Battle of Delium in 424 BC, where the Thebans defeated the Athenians. Historian Victor Davis Hanson has said this: "What went on for about an hour or so in that nondescript plain changed the life of ancient Greece and the nature of European civilization itself." The consequences of this battle, according to Hanson, included a transformation of philosophy — Socrates fought in the battle — an artistic renaissance, and the creation in the West of infantry tactics. Now, on the surface, this astonishingly important battle seems like every other ancient bloodletting. During this time, the engagement of hoplite infantry was a standard and sanguinary affair. Some soldiers wore heavy armor, some not. Multiple hoplite phalanxes totaling thousands of armored soldiers would crash into each other. They would slash with edged weapons until one side or the other would be literally pushed off the field of battle, leaving thousands of dead and dying behind. In such a melee, generalship was hardly needed. The Greeks prized personal courage, and the leaders of both sides joined their troops in chaotic battle. But this battle at Delium unfolded very differently. We're not quite certain how or why, but an obscure Theban general by the name of Pagondas exhibited a radically new mode of combat. Pagondas was the Theban general who led his people to victory over the Athenians. We know almost nothing about Pagondas, except that his brilliant moves at Delium meant a tremendous breakthrough in the science of tactics. He not only assembled his resources differently, positioned them differently, and maneuvered them differently, he commanded them differently as well. Now, the stakes of this battle at Delium are obscure. There was, in fact, no reason at all to have the battle in this particular place, other than the two sides elected to fight it. No key features of the terrain that made this stretch of territory inherently valuable. There was nothing urgent at stake. The course of the battle was straightforward. The Athenians marched out to the valley near Delium with 20,000 troops, but they turned back after their supporting troops failed to appear. Now, rather than allow the Athenians to flee, General Pagondas urged the Thebans to pursue and close with them. In this move, Pagondas developed the principles of forward defense, later embraced by Vegetius, and the principle of preemption, striking an enemy that poses a long-term threat rather than an immediate threat. The battlefield itself was rippled with gentle slopes, able to conceal bodies of troops. A ravine to the left and a ravine to the right marked the boundaries of the field and channeled the forces toward each other. Pagondas and his Thebans defended a vigorous attack on their left while attacking on their right. This was standard, as both sides traditionally posted their finest troops on the far right flank. The battle raged for an hour, and as the Athenians pressed their attack on the Theban left, they sensed victory. But then a specter appeared, charging the Athenians from over the nearest hill. It must have been a terrifying sight. Fresh companies of Theban cavalry, held in reserve, now attacked in concert with the infantry. They must have been conjured from the air itself. General Pagondas had ordered them forward at the moment of greatest peril. This was unheard of. This was extreme. This was the first recorded use of deliberate reserves joining an attack, and integrated with horse cavalry, it was psychologically devastating to the Athenians, who panicked. Their ranks shattered, and they fled. 4 incredible things had occurred at once. First, General Pagondas had maintained a reserve force of cavalry, and he had maneuvered them out of sight to his extreme left. Second, at the moment of seeming Athenian triumph, he ordered his cavalry forward to surprise, to disrupt, and to cut down the Athenian infantry. Third, unlike his Greek counterpart, General Pagandus was not at the forefront of the fighting. Instead, he monitored the situation and controlled his forces from a distance, much as a modern general might do. And fourth, he had deepened the ranks of his own right wing to give added weight to his flank and ensure superiority at that point. Pagandus was also responsible for other innovations. He created a unit of shock troops with a select band of 300 called the charioteers and foot soldiers. This is the first use of what we call today an elite corps or special forces. Delium also saw the first use of a flamethrower, which Theban forces used to scourge the remnants of Athenian troops who had taken refuge after the battle in the precinct of Apollo at Delium. And so the Battle of Delium counts as the birthplace of a science of Western tactics. It is here, at Delium, that the abstract knowledge of how to manipulate forces on the battlefield to overcome enemy numerical superiority, unfavorable terrain, or inadequate training and weaponry began. The old checklist approach had been replaced. Just crashing and slashing into one another with all one's might had been replaced. The arrival of tactics meant that forces could appear at special times, have special abilities, use special formations, and place the commander in a special location. So here we come to our second strategic lesson for today. Surprise innovations can often turn the tide of an evenly matched struggle. So here's your task. Where are you stuck fighting a battle with traditional tactics? Can you think of a completely new way to fight, one that will catch your opponent or competitor off guard, just as General Pagandus outmaneuvered the Athenians through innovation? Roughly contemporaneous with the internecine Greek wars of the 5th century and halfway around the world, another civilization was spawning another influential contributor to strategic thinking. China offers us one of the most well-known examples of strategic theory, the art of war, popularly attributed to Sun Tzu. Some scholars have suggested the work might have several authors, or even that Sun Tzu might be wholly mythical, but a majority of scholars now think that the author was an actual historical figure, a military general named Sun Wu, who served under King Helu of Wu in and around 512 BC. This work was perhaps expanded by others in subsequent centuries, and it greatly influenced military thinking in Asia, and it impacted Western military thought beginning in the 19th century. Sun Tzu's brilliance lay not in providing a checklist of how to wage war or to compete against one's enemies, but in his recognition of the fluid nature of reality and how any practitioner of strategy must constantly adapt to that reality. In fact, Sun Tzu enunciated his principles so that they can apply in several arenas, from the battlefield to public administration, to planning, to diplomacy and international negotiation. Key to Sun Tzu's thinking and the lesson of his work for our own strategic thinking is his realization that all plans are temporary. Sun Tzu knew that a plan can become obsolete as soon as it's crafted. He said that the decision to position your forces in competition depends on two major factors. The decision must be based first on objective conditions in the physical environment, and second, the subjective beliefs of your competitors in that environment. Here, Sun Tzu originates a view shared by elite strategic theorists all the way to the present, that the most brilliant plans are those that spring into being in the dynamic of action and response. In hindsight, the plan can appear foreordained, however brilliant, but it is really the result of decision and counter-decision in the heat of the moment by those trained to think strategically and tactically. This action-response dynamic infuses Sun Tzu's writings with power, and it confers on those writings their relevance today. Sun Tzu thought that strategy was not mere planning in the sense of working through an established list. Instead, strategy requires rapid responses to changing conditions based on sound judgment and principles. Now, sure, planning works in a controlled environment, but in a rapidly changing environment, competing plans collide, and this collision creates unexpected situations. It is our response to those unforeseen situations that mean the difference between victory and defeat. Sun Tzu's approach to the study of war elevated the activity to the realm of philosophy. digging a deep foundation for what to some might appear the work of the artisan, of the craftsman. For Sun Tzu, the activity of war was too pivotal in the lives of men to leave to the whim of mere practitioners. He said this: "Warfare is the greatest affair of state, the basis of life and death, the way, the Tao, to survival or extinction. It must be thoroughly pondered and analyzed." Again, let's pause and think. How can you apply Sun Tzu's lessons to your own life? Where do you rely on an outdated plan? Think like Sun Tzu. Figure how and why your plans went awry, and how that understanding can help you correct course. Hannibal Barca was a Carthaginian general who plagued the Roman Republic from the 3rd century into the 2nd century BC. He fought the Romans to a great victory in 216 BC, a victory that has forever stood as the archetype for a crushing annihilation of an enemy. Hannibal fought outnumbered in the enemy's homeland, and he still won. He succeeded in this thanks to his different approach to battle. In 216 BC, at the Battle of Cannae, Hannibal triumphed over the numerically superior Romans thanks to his revolutionary manipulation of the forces at his disposal. This new approach to battle earned him the title Father of Strategy by one of his biographers, Theodore Aralt Dodge, himself a courageous veteran of the American Civil War. At the time, the standard tactics dictated that formations of soldiers would line up abreast of each other in a phalanx, march forward, collide, and do battle with much pushing and shoving. It was thought that numerical superiority was the key to victory. Hannibal was outnumbered badly, so he should have lost. But, armed with fewer resources than his Roman enemies, Hannibal configured his forces differently. He didn't follow best practices of his day and line his soldiers up in the usual way. Instead, he maneuvered and outmaneuvered and outsmarted his Roman enemy with a battle plan that turned the Romans' own tactics and tendencies against them. It was Hannibal's bold way of thinking that yielded his success in battle, not the following of a checklist of the contemporary strategy. Hannibal's forces were outnumbered. Estimates vary, maybe 80,000 Romans versus 40,000 infantry and 10,000 cavalry. In the conventional military thinking of the day, this meant a Roman victory should be inevitable, especially as we note that Hannibal's forces were a motley collection of mercenaries from Africa, Spain, and Gaul, and they were more poorly armed than their Roman counterparts. But the Carthaginians had the advantage of superior strategy and tactics under superior generalship. Here are the ways that Hannibal upended the conventional thinking of his time. Opposing Hannibal was the Roman army under 2 consuls, Paulus and Varro, and they rotated command of the army each day. Paulus was cautious, and Varro was impetuous. This Jekyll and Hyde leadership arrangement meant discontinuity in execution. In fact, Hannibal knew the hot-headed Varro was commanding on the day of the battle, and he counted on Varro's fervor to lead the Roman army to its destruction in a series of blunders. First, the Romans marched forward in a narrow and deep phalanx that matched the front of Hannibal's smaller force. The Romans could have easily extended their front to either side of the Carthaginians. That maneuver alone might have saved them from eventual destruction, but they did not. The Romans presented a narrow front, and this alone greatly negated the Roman numerical advantage. Of what use are superior numbers if the vast majority of them cannot reach the enemy? Second, Roman training dictated that they pursue a fleeing opponent. So when the Gauls and the Spaniards to their front appeared to break and withdraw, the Romans pressed forward. This left the African infantry to the Roman flanks, where they were most vulnerable. Third, the Romans were taken unawares at a change in cavalry tactics. Once Hannibal's cavalry had driven off the Roman cavalry, his horsemen did not pursue the Romans, as was customary. Instead, the horsemen fell upon the rear of the masses of Roman infantry, which became more tightly packed by the minute. The envelopment of the Romans was complete, their destruction inevitable. Hannibal achieved the greatest and most complete victory in the history of warfare by utilizing not superior numbers and strength, but by superior strategy and extraordinary tactical execution to envelop a superior foe and completely destroy it. 50,000 Roman soldiers died that day, not from lack of equipment, not from lack of numbers, not from lack of courage. They perished because of superior strategy and flawless execution. And that is Hannibal's lesson for us. When faced with superior competitors, you can use your knowledge of their habits and their weaknesses to outsmart them. Pause now. Survey your own competitors. Which ones have quirks or weaknesses that you know about? How can you invert commonplace thinking and outmaneuver them when they're falsely feeling most confident? The most brilliant of strategic contributions are often those we take most for granted. The world at large has largely forgotten the man called Vegetius, and this is because his brilliance has become our commonplace. Vegetius was a Roman administrator who lived in the late 4th century AD, during a period of Roman decline. In fact, the empire disintegrated a century later. At the request of Emperor Valentinian, Vegetius prepared a treatise called Epitoma Rei Militaris, or a summary of military matters. With the Roman Empire in decline, Emperor Valentinian wanted to know how his own ancient Romans had organized their military matters so successfully. The result was Vegetius's summary, which became the most popular military handbook for more than 1,000 years after its publication. It became, in fact, the military Bible of Europe until the Napoleonic era. George Washington carried a copy with him and even made his own notations in the margins. Open a copy and discover a list of seemingly pedestrian topics, the selection of recruits, their training in arms, and the training in battle formations, organizational topics of unit division, promotion and pay, auxiliary services, legion battle tactics, and the use of fortifications and of naval power. A layman might ask, how does this detailed and mundane prescription for the organization of a Roman legion link to high-concept strategy? Where is the theory? Where are the secrets of battle, the keys to victory? The key, as we shall see time and again, lies here, in our own minds, in our cerebrations. The triumvirate of strategy is intentions, capabilities, and resources. The whole of Vegetius's work addresses how the military may develop its capability to achieve the aims of strategy. The dominant theme running throughout Vegetius's work is built around the development of superior military capability prior to battle. He hammers home the quartet of thorough training, strong discipline, hard work, and sound planning. These are the elements of strategic preparation that form the heart of strategic capability. Key among his directives was an emphasis on need for strategic reserves, and he was quite specific as to their use. Vegetius wrote this: "It is much better to have several bodies of reserves than to extend your front too much. Reserves should be posted in rear of the wings and some near the center, to be ready to fly immediately to the assistance of any part of the line which is hard pressed, to prevent its being pierced, and thereby to keep up the courage of the soldiers and to check the impetuosity of the enemy." Here in Vegetius we find echoes of General Pagandus centuries earlier at Delium, who first exercised the use of a reserve force to decisive effect. Vegetius codified this notion and many others. The work of Vegetius was too late to resuscitate the failing Roman Empire, but his prescriptions guided military thought and organization for 10 more centuries. Few ideas are that durable. You probably have strategic reserves in your own business conflicts. Stop. Write out all the areas where you feel that your own company has uncommonly strong reserves. Where can you hold off deploying all your resources to lure your competitors into a false sense of confidence? How can you spring these resources on the competitor suddenly and with overwhelming effect? As in so many other areas, the Renaissance saw a flowering of political theory and strategic thought. Niccolo Machiavelli is one of the most important political theorists in history. He is a bridge from the ancient to the modern. The world of Machiavelli, the time of the Renaissance, which began in the Italian city of Florence in the late 1300s, Machiavelli was born in Florence in 1469, and he received an excellent humanist education. He worked in several government positions as civil servant and diplomat, and he grew increasingly distressed by the inability of Italian city-states to resist the increasingly bold incursions of France, Spain, and the Holy Roman Empire. In 1512, the government of Florence was overthrown by a Spanish army, and Machiavelli was put in jail, tortured, and exiled to his farm outside of Florence in 1513. It was there he began to reflect and to write. His most famous work, The Prince, has cemented his place in history. But we're equally concerned with Machiavelli's lesser-known work, The Art of War, published in 1521. Prior to Machiavelli, much writing and instruction emphasized moralizing and divine guidance. In The Prince, Machiavelli advocated a more coldly reasoned line of behavior to maintain a monarch in power, a ruthless pursuit of self-interest. The Prince, in fact, was a manifesto of guidance that Machiavelli prepared for the Italian ruling family of the Medicis. In The Art of War, Machiavelli extended this amoral reasoning to the battlefield. In the welter of political advice that Machiavelli crafts, he offers to us two key concepts worth our consideration: virtù and fortuna. Virtù and fortuna represent the internal and external elements of strategic thinking. Let's look at each in turn. Virtù is not, as we think of it today, virtue, the notion of living life as a good and pious fellow, someone imbued with moral excellence. Far from it. As with so much of the analytically rich writings of Machiavelli, virtù is a word freighted with substance and nuance. It incorporates many qualities in combination: flexibility, foresight, individuality and ability, energy, political acumen, prowess, vital force. Virtù is a skill you can develop, sharpen, just as you might practice the professions of weaver or blacksmith or tailor, each with its own vocational requirements. Machiavelli says this: a ruler must be half lion and half fox, a fox to discern the toils, a lion to drive off the wolves. Merciful, faithful, humane, religious, just, these he may be, and above all, should seem to be, nor should any word escape his lips to give the lie to his professions. He should, if possible, practice goodness, but under necessity should know how to pursue evil. Coupled with virtù is the notion of fortuna. Conventional thinkers of the time treated Fortuna as a mostly benign goddess, as the source of human goods as well as evils. In contrast, Machiavelli conceived fortune as a malevolent and uncompromising source of human misery, affliction, and disaster, an unpredictable and destructive force. And Machiavelli therefore counseled that the good general must beat and maul fortune into submission so as to rule or be ruled. Machiavelli believed that one should meet the external forces of Fortuna aggressively. One cultivates virtù to overcome the destructive caprice of Fortuna. Machiavelli put it this way: fortune is still a fickle jade, but at least the half our will is free, and if we are bold, we may master her yet. Machiavelli's metaphors lack our enlightened view of gender, but following his advice is not about being evil. Instead, this is what we today would call a bias toward action. It's a call for boldness, decisiveness. The impetuous and active ruler is rewarded. In The Art of War, virtù describes the strategic prowess of the general who adapts to different battlefield conditions as the situation dictates. Quote, in a word, he must realize and face his own position and the facts of mankind and of the world. This is what virtù provides: the ability to respond to fortune at any time and in any way that is necessary. This joining of actor with the environment is an early formulation of the concept of emergent strategy. Since we cannot predict what Fortuna will hand to us, we must focus and develop the internal qualities and capabilities that enable us to meet those uncertainties in the best manner possible. So this is your last challenge for today. Ask yourself, do I have virtù? Have I developed the flexibility, the foresight, and energy to outwit even unpredictable fortune? This isn't an easy question to answer honestly. Think back to an unexpected situation that overwhelmed you in the past. Have you learned from it? And if not, how can you? The ancients of strategy provide us not only enjoyable tales of long ago battles, but of actual modes of thinking and practical guidance that we can use right now. First, start with tactics. Any area, no matter how dominated by thoughtless effort, can be transformed by the application of tactics. Try to have special forces used at special times in special ways. Second, plans must change. Learn to recognize the fluid nature of reality and how any strategy must constantly adapt to that reality. The most brilliant plans are those that spring into being in the action-response dynamic of the moment. Third, prepare, prepare, prepare. Strategic preparation is the heart of strategic capability, and this has been true ever since the Roman Empire. Whether you're running a household or a billion-dollar business, training, strong discipline, hard work, and sound planning are the foundation of strategic reserves, which are necessary for many kinds of strategic maneuver. If you have no reserves, you have no strategy. Fourth, know your opponents. You can gain astonishing leverage if you know the preparations and capabilities of your opponents. A combination of surprise and superb tactical execution can allow you to defeat an opponent with twice your strength. Fifth, boldness. You can seize your fortune. The greatest challenge in strategic thinking is getting started. The long and hoary tradition of strategic thought has already struggled with the issues we face every day. That's why it's a natural gateway to strategic thinking in our own lives. We can learn from ancient strategic ideas, but even more important is to learn from their example, to have strategic ideas of our own.